welcome back to another episode of the Bulletproof Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Drew Rosenchuck. You can follow me on Twitter at DFBeanCounter, and I am psyched to be back on the airwaves after missing last week. I have to be honest with you, my life has been turned upside down for the last month or so. It's gonna still be chaotic for another month, and then starting in July 1 is when it all smooths out for me, and I am excited because I'm going to have a lot more time to spend with you talking about fantasy football, talking about dynasty fantasy football, talking about redraft fantasy football, talking about whatever fantasy football you want. Time will be on our side, and it's not on my side right now, so bear with me for the next month. It'll be worth it, I promise. Anyways, today we are talking Austin Ekeler because I keep getting told that the patrons want to draft Trey Sermon in the late first round. And I keep saying you don't draft Trey Sermon in the late first round. And the reason you don't draft Trey Sermon in the late first round is because you can get Austin Ekeler for a late first and a late second. And you should just do that instead of going and getting Trey Sermon on your team. We'll talk Trey Sermon later. Another episode, not this one. Today we're talking Ekeler. And we need to talk about how we got here, because I have not been on the Ekeler side in the past. Coming into the 2020 season, I was not telling you to buy Austin Ekeler even though Melvin Gordon was gone, because in 2019, Austin Ekeler had an incredible stretch, right? Melvin Gordon held out. Ekeler had the backfield to himself for 5 games. He put up 25.86 fantasy points per game over those first 5 weeks. People were excited. They were like, this is Christian McCaffrey light. We are going to win our leagues because of Austin Ekeler. And that was never going to happen. People were ignoring the fact of how he got those 25.86 fantasy points per game for the first 5 weeks. He had a 15 reception game in there. That's not repeatable. A 15 reception game over the course of an entire season, yeah, that gets smoothed out. A 15 reception game over the course of 5 games skews the entire data. He also had 5 touchdowns through 5 weeks. I don't know if you know this, but not many running backs score 16 touchdowns a year. Austin Ekeler probably isn't one of them. He was living he was having an out-of-body experience in that Melvin Gordon holdout era. And small sample sizes are dangerous. Just ask the Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb stands how they feel about small sample sizes in 2022, because they are falling into the same trap right now when they look at the splits with Dak Prescott. Oh, but Dak Prescott and Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb, they were lighting the league ablaze. I got bad news for you. That wasn't sustainable. Look at the pass volume over that 5-game stretch, or that 4-game stretch with Dak. It ain't happening. This is the same problem that we run into time and time again, and why we don't use small samples and extrapolate. We look at usage. We look at projections. We do not just take last year's numbers, chop it up into our favorite sample, and then extrapolate it and say, yep, that's exactly what we should expect. We should expect 15 reception games and a touchdown a week from Austin Ekeler. Never going to happen. That's why we don't do it that way. Anyways, let's carry on. So Ekeler obviously goes out in 2020 and puts up not 25.6 fantasy points per game, because of course he didn't, because he was never going to, because we were smart enough to realize that he doesn't score a touchdown a game. He doesn't get 15 receptions per game, or even one game. But he does put up a completely repeatable 16.5 fantasy points per game, which is very, very similar to the projection that we had, where we had him ranked, or we had him projected for, I believe it was running back 13 or 14. I think he finished around running back 10 or 11 last year. So we're pretty damn close on the projection. The difference was Justin Herbert was a lot better than I thought he was going to be. Justin Herbert had a rookie year for the ages, obviously. He was absolutely fantastic, and we should see growth to his game this year, which means that all those stats where we're looking at and saying, I don't know if that's sustainable, they aren't sustainable. Don't get me wrong. But we should expect growth from Justin Herbert overall. And when we see growth from him, that should offset some of those unsustainable stats that he was putting up. Anyways, between Justin Herbert, Austin Ekeler, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, for the record, isn't a good fantasy player. He's a pretty good wide receiver, though. Like all things considered, if I had to pick a wide receiver that was completely irrelevant for fantasy to have my favorite team as a wide receiver too, Mike Williams would be up there. He absolutely would be. So between those 4 guys, we have a pretty dynamic offense. They're probably not going to be, the Kansas City Chiefs and the top offense in the NFL, but they're probably going to be a top 10 offense, and at worst, top half of the league. That's what we should expect. And a lot of the reasons that I like DeAndre Swift are the same reasons that I like Austin Ekeler. DeAndre Swift has an absolutely awesome floor. He has an RB1 floor because of his passing game usage and his passing game skills. Ekeler has that. The reason we don't like Ekeler as much as DeAndre Swift is because Ekeler does not have a 3-down skill set. he is never going to be completely unlocked in a Christian McCaffrey manner in which he scores 25.6 fantasy points per game over the course of an entire season. DeAndre Swift, on the other hand, could have that. It's possible. I'm not saying it will. It's possible. Ekeler, it's impossible. He's only 199 pounds, and that takes 3 down back completely off the table. That being said, Ekeler is an elite receiving option out of the backfield. His receiving ability, with a bit of rushing work sprinkled in, because he's not going to get nothing in the rushing game, that's going to put him in the back end of the RB1 range with his floor, just like we had projected last year. The problem is that's also pretty much his ceiling. Austin Ekeler is a very much you know what you're going to get because he's so good at what he does, and there's just very little hope that he could be anything more than that. If you want to know how good he is at receiving, in the receiving game, his target share in 2020 was 17.3%, number 4 among running backs in the world. His yards per route run was 1.76. His catch rate, 83.1%, number 5. Ekeler did one of those things where you're like super high volume and super efficient. This isn't a small sample trap where we're like, oh, well, his efficiency could just be because he had so few touches. He had all the touches and he was the most efficient, which means he's really freaking good at catching footballs. His PFF receiving grade, number 5 in the world among running backs with 30 targets, 81.5 receiving grade according to PFF. Dude's good. People tell me all the time, I need to reach on running back X in my draft because I need a running back. Running backs are scarce. I know this. This is why I tell you to move mountains to get young stud running backs on your team. This is why we were stacking Cam Akers and DeAndre Swift repeatedly last year. It was trade down from Jonathan Taylor and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, get Swift, get Akers, get future picks, get late first, get early seconds, get more than that, but you cannot trade out of it unless you're getting one of these future stud running backs. Running backs matter. Don't get me wrong. They're the most impactful position in fantasy football, even superflex leagues. But guys like Trey Sermon and Michael Carter aren't it. We know that running backs need to be good at football. Not necessarily to score points, because running backs are largely replaceable, but what they need to do is win the freaking starting job in the first place and then keep the starting job. And Trey Sermon and Michael Carter are not, neither of those guys are good enough to hold the starting job. They might get the starting job if the guy ahead of them gets hurt or is really bad, because that's probably what's going to happen because the guys ahead of them are really bad. They'll probably get a chance, but they ain't keeping the job. And we don't know for how long before they completely faceplant. Anyways, instead of lighting your draft pick on fire and picking Michael Carter or Trey Sermon in the late first round, just add a second round pick. Go and get Austin Ekeler. Ekeler is exactly what you're looking for. If you are a running back one away from a championship, buy Austin Ekeler. Do not buy Trey Sermon. Do not buy Michael Carter. Go and get Austin Ekeler. Austin Ekeler's value, according to Keep Trade Cut, like I said, is a late first and a late second round pick. Pay the price. Get Austin Ekeler. The interesting thing about this is Austin Ekeler is only 26 years old. He isn't going to disappear. If he has another running back one season or thereabouts in 2021, which he probably will, you're going to be able to sell him next offseason for a late first round pick. You are going to rent Austin Ekeler for a late second round pick in the 2021 draft, which is probably going to be a day 3 player because there aren't very many good players in this class. It's a really, really good class at the top. The first 15, 16 picks, fantastic. After that, it gets scary fast. Austin Ekeler is the kind of guy that you want to be able to buy. You can't go and buy Dalvin Cook for cheap. You can't go and buy, Alvin Kamara for cheap. You can go and buy Austin Ekeler for cheap, and you should.